Hello board gamers, in this video I'll be talking about one of the recent abstract board games called Cascadia. We'll go through the rules of the game and I'll do a mini comparison at the end with Calico. So let's get right into it. Cascadia is a 1-to-4 player board game where you are trying to build an ecosystem consisting of habitat tiles and wildlife tokens. Each player will start with a unique 3-tile habitat. Then 5 scoring cards, each representing one of the 5 wildlife animals in the game, will be randomly set up in the middle of the table, along with 4 random habitat tiles and 4 random wildlife tokens just below it. A number of random habitat tiles will then be removed based on player count, and you are now ready to start the game. During a player's turn, the first thing to do is to take one habitat tile and one animal token from the same column. If there are 3 of the same animal tokens, you can optionally reset those 3 first before making a choice. But if all 4 are the same, then they all must be reset. Once you have made your choice, you will then have to integrate both of them into your ecosystem. The habitat tile can be placed anywhere adjacent to your current ecosystem, and you can rotate the hex around as part of its placement as long as at least one of the 6 hex sides fully touches. So something like this will not be a legal move. The wildlife tokens, on the other hand, has a bit more restriction as it can only be placed on an empty habitat that allows it. Each habitat will show you what animals can be placed on it. So in this example, you can only place your elk token on the 3rd hex. If you cannot place a wildlife token on any of your habitats, well, you're just going to lose it. Sometimes you'll get a very restrictive habitat called a keystone tile where you can only place one specific wildlife in it. But if you do actually place a wildlife token on it, you will get this pinecone token as a reward. You could use one of them during the choosing phase to either A, break the same column rule and take whichever one hex and one token instead, or B, reset any number of wildlife tokens before you choose a column. So that was how to place hexes and tokens legally. Scoring them though follows a different rule. At the end of the game, the hexes and the wildlife tokens are scored separately. So let's first talk about scoring these habitats. There are 5 different habitat types in the game and you will only score the one biggest cluster of each type. In this example, there are 3 clusters of prairies in this ecosystem. 2 of them consisted of 2 hexes while the other one is just a single hex. Since we only scored the biggest one cluster, this ecosystem currently only scores 2 points for prairies as one hex is worth 1 point. Ideally, we would want to join these 2 prairies together before the game ends, so it makes this one giant cluster that will score us a lot more. Also, if you manage to have the biggest or second biggest prairie cluster out of everyone, you'll get bonus points for the majority. The other 4 hex types in this ecosystem will then be scored the same way. And that's all for the habitat scoring. So let's move on to the wildlife tokens. Each wildlife can score in 4 different ways. But as we already know, only one scoring card is used for each wildlife type. So let's use these 5 cards as an example. The bear card will score you points for clusters of exactly 2 bears in your ecosystem. The card tells you the amount of points that you will get for the amount of clusters that you have. So in this example, as you have 2 clusters of 2 bears in your area, you will get 11 points from this card. But be careful to not connect the bear cluster somehow, because in this case, you'll be counting this as one giant cluster of 5 bears, which does not fulfill the criteria for scoring. Moving on, we have this elk card, which will score clusters of specific shape as shown on the card. Something like this would give you 13 points in total, but if you had put it like this instead, it will just count as 2 clusters of a 3 and a 1. The scoring patterns on the left can also be rotated around as long as they maintain their relative shape. So yes, both of these will score 9 points. Up next, we have the salmon, which also scores in groups, but they want you to make a quote-unquote salmon run. The definition of a salmon run is basically interconnecting salmons, where a salmon can only be adjacent to a maximum of 2 other salmons. So a small run of 4 like this will score you 11 points with this card. Though if you later place another salmon here, you've just made this whole cluster invalid, as this particular salmon now has 3 other salmons adjacent to it. You can make multiple runs and score them separately. Just be careful when you are thinking of joining them, as they can either lose you points or just straight up destroy both clusters completely. Oh, by the way, I find it easier to teach the salmon run when I tell everyone it's more like a snake instead, but I was quickly made known that 2-headed snakes are of course a thing. So I naturally took that as a challenge and begrudgingly tell them to imagine a salmon centipede instead. And I think it's safe to say that it worked. Up next, we have the hawks, which unlike the previous 3, usually likes to be alone. For this card, you score each hawk that is not adjacent to another hawk. So in this case, only these 3 hawks will score us points, as the other 2 over here are next to each other, making them both invalid for scoring. And according to this card, 3 hawks will give us 8 points in total. And lastly, you have the fox, which is probably the most interesting one out of the 5, because they score depending on the animals around them. For example, this card will tell you how much a fox will score depending on how many unique animals are next to that fox. If, say, the fox is surrounded by 3 bears and 3 salmons, then there's only 2 unique animals surrounding the fox, which according to this card will give us 2 points. Each fox that you have is scored individually. So say later on another fox and hawk is placed here, this second fox will then score 3 points instead, since it is surrounded by 3 unique animals. So yeah, after a player has chosen a wildlife token and a habitat hex, both of them will then be integrated into the player's ecosystem. A new set of hex and token is then revealed, and the next player clockwise will do the same 2 things. This goes on until you cannot replenish the hexes anymore. The game is over at that point, point, and everyone scores their own ecosystem. The player with the most points will then be the winner of the game. And that's basically all the rules to play this game. So how good is Cascadia? The game gets a resounding okay from me. I would still give it a solid 7 or even 7.5 out of 10. The game looks nice, is easy to teach, very beginner friendly, and basically language independent. Also, the game's puzzle can be quite challenging as the best move is often not that obvious. You ideally want to place both hex and token in a way that maximizes these two scoring objectives, but you oftentimes will have to partially sacrifice one or the other. For example, in this scenario, you have two potential pairs of token and hex that you can take. The first pair allows you to expand two types of habitat, which is the best thing you can do for your habitat scoring. And you also get to start your hawk scoring. However, this same hex does not allow you to put an elk on it, which will hinder you from getting the highest elk scoring. Alternatively, the second set allows you to complete the elk group, giving you maximum elk scoring, and you will get a pinecone token from filling that keystone hex. However, this same hex is pretty out of place as it does not help your habitat scoring at all. Yep, these are the types of decisions that you will have to make. Moving on to the negatives, well, I honestly don't really have many things to complain about. I wasn't really a fan of the foxes at first because they are definitely the trickiest ones to score. Out of the 4 to 5 sessions that I've had with this game, the fox is clearly everyone's least favorite as they often just clog up the market, and if someone did reset them, they can just reappear again in the market right after. The fox did eventually grow on me, mostly because it's really satisfying when you can actually use them effectively. Then there's also the player interaction or the lack thereof. At most, you're just glancing around to see what everyone else is doing and get annoyed when the hexes or tokens that you want are taken by someone else. Yes, the game is very much textbook multiplayer solitaire. I tend to enjoy games that have more interactions nowadays, like Azul, but I do realize that this is purely preference as those two are opposites in some ways. All in all, Cascadia is a pretty good puzzle game, especially if you don't mind the lack of interaction, though there's really nothing mind-blowing about it, and it's admittedly not the most exciting game to me. Alright, now it's time to compare Cascadia to Calico. The two games actually has a lot more parallels than I initially thought. In both games, you are strategically placing hexes to gain points. The hexes in each game can have two different things. Cascadia has habitat types and wildlife tokens, while Calico has colors and patterns. The way that these hexes score are also largely quite similar, as you are expected to group up the same things together, like groups of bears in Cascadia or groups of this pattern in Calico. And lastly, both games are puzzly multiplayer solitaires. The biggest difference in these two games, apart from the wildlife versus cats theme, is their difficulties. To me, playing Calico is like playing Cascadia on Ultra Nightmare mode. Okay, maybe a bit of exaggeration there, but let me explain. As we have discussed earlier, both games have two components that are related to scoring. In Cascadia, these two components are two physically separate things, which allows you to place each one independently. In Calico, well, not so much. This forces you to always put both components in the same location, therefore making placement not as easy or flexible. And to make things even more challenging, Calico also has this personal scoring mechanic where you try to surround it following a specific rule. For example, this particular one wants us to surround it with completely different things. There are 3 ways to do this. Option number 1 is to surround it with completely different colors while ignoring the patterns, or 2, use completely different patterns instead and ignore the colors. Doing one of these two options will net you 10 points. Alternatively, you could do the third harder option where you are basically doing both option 1 and 2 at the same time by surrounding it with different colors and patterns. Doing so will give you 15 points instead. This mechanic is not present in Cascadia, meaning that you have more things to think about in Calico. Combining all of that together, you have this hellishly more difficult game that still resembles Cascadia. Up to this point, Calico is still pretty good, but I start having reservations when I realized how lucky this game can be. In Cascadia, you always have 4 columns of choices from the market. Yes, there is a bit of luck in this as they are randomly set up and refreshed, but the game gives you some flexibility and luck mitigation in the form of pinecone tokens and free resets. Calico, on the other hand, only gives you a choice of 3 hexes, where players will pick one from each turn and have it refreshed. That is literally it. No luck mitigations, not even free resets. For a brain-burning puzzle of a game, it really doesn't feel great when your options are often limited by the luck of the draw. Sometimes you just gotta pray to the RNG gods that the tile you wanted will appear during your turn, or it might get stolen by someone else, especially if they know that you need it. And with that, Cascadia to me feels like a more polished and welcoming version of Calico, which is why I much prefer the former. And yeah, hope you enjoyed this review. Check out my channel for more reviews like this. See ya!